The restaurant went quiet the way rooms only do when someone is being destroyed in public. It wasn't loud. That was the thing. Arthur Crane didn't need to raise his voice. Men like him learned long ago that cruelty lands harder when it's calm. He set his wine glass down with the slow, deliberate weight of someone who wanted the sound to carry, and he looked at the waiter the way you look at something you've already decided doesn't matter. "Do you have any idea?" he said, each word placed carefully like a knife on a table. "What incompetence cost a man like me?" The waiter didn't flinch. He was olive-skinned, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of stillness in his eyes that doesn't belong to a frightened man. He held his tray at his side and said nothing. Around the room, forks had stopped moving. A woman at the next table looked away. A young busboy near the kitchen door found something very interesting to stare at on the floor. Arthur Crane was the CEO of Crane Capital Group. His name was on 37 floors of glass in Midtown Manhattan. In his entire life, no one he considered beneath him had ever told him no. He had no idea who he was talking to. Because here is what no one in that room knew about the man standing there in that uniform, absorbing every word without blinking. Not the other diners, not the manager, not Arthur Crane himself. And if this story had ended just 5 minutes earlier, Marcos Vidal would have let them all keep not knowing. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand where Marcos Vidal came from. He was born in Cordoba, Argentina, the second son of a schoolteacher and a mechanic. They were not wealthy people, but they were serious ones. His father used to say the same thing every morning before school, standing at the kitchen door with grease still under his fingernails. "Everything they can take from you, they will, except what's in here." He would tap his temple. "That you keep." Marcos kept it. He won a full scholarship at 17, graduated near the top of his class with a degree in economics. And at 26, he packed 2 suitcases, said goodbye to his parents at the airport in a way that none of them acknowledged might be the last time, and flew to New York City with enough money for 3 months of rent and a vocabulary built almost entirely from English-language paperbacks he'd borrowed from a church library back home. And he was broke for exactly 2 years. Then he wasn't. His first company, a small logistics firm connecting South American suppliers with mid-size American retailers, took 4 years to build and sold in 14 months once the right buyer noticed it. His second company took 3 years and sold faster. By the time he was 38, Marcos Vidal was the kind of man who got calls returned, who sat at tables where decisions were made, who had quietly and without any fanfare built a life his father's hands had pointed him toward. And then he met Elena. She was working the floor of a restaurant in the West Village when they met, not because she needed to, but because she loved it. She had a master's degree in hospitality management and could have run any hotel in the city. She chose restaurants instead, but she said they were the last honest places. Everyone who walked through the door was hungry. Everyone needed something. And a good person working the floor could make a stranger feel for 1 hour like they belonged exactly where they were sitting. Marcos had never thought about restaurants that way. He thought about them the way most people do, as transactions. You ordered, you ate, you left. Elena changed that. She changed a lot of things. They were married 4 years after they met. Tomas came 2 years after that. And for a long time, life was the kind of thing you didn't examine too carefully because you were afraid that looking directly at it might somehow disturb it. Then Elena got sick. It started small, the way those things always do. A tiredness that didn't go away. A doctor's appointment that led to another. And then one afternoon, Marcos was sitting in a hospital hallway with a paper cup of cold coffee in his hands, being told something he would spend the next 2 years trying to find a way around. And there was no way around it. She fought for 14 months. She was brave in a way that embarrassed everyone around her into being braver than they thought they could be. And then, on a Tuesday morning in late October, she was gone. Marcos did not fall apart. He did something quieter and in some ways worse. He folded himself up. He sold a stake in his second company. He stepped back from the boardrooms and the phone calls and the tables where decisions were made. He picked Tomas up from school every day and made dinner and helped with homework and kept the apartment exactly the way Elena had arranged it. And at night, and after Tomas was asleep, he sat in the kitchen and felt the specific silence of a life that had been built for 2 and was now being lived by 1. 18 months ago, he had found the Vidal Reinhold Group, a collection of 5 Manhattan restaurants that Elena had loved. She used to bring him to them one by one over the years, pointing out small things he would never have noticed on his own. The way the lighting changed the mood of the room, the particular rhythm of a floor team that trusted each other, the difference between a waiter who was doing a job and one who actually cared. He had listened then because she was talking. He bought in because it was the closest he could get to sitting across from her again. He did not take an office. He took a uniform. The staff knew him as Marco, quiet, never late. But the kind of colleague who covered your shift without asking for anything in return. If any of them had ever looked up his name in the ownership records, none of them mentioned it, and Marcos did not offer. He was good at not being noticed. He had been practicing for a long time. Now he stood in the hallway behind the dining room, holding a tray he no longer remembered picking back up, looking through the glass partition at Arthur Crane, who was louder now, performing for his associates. Someone's phone raised and pointed. The storm outside pressed against the windows. The room on the other side of the glass had gone the particular still that meant everyone was watching and no one was going to do anything. Marcos had survived worse than this. He had already decided he could survive this too. And then he saw Tomas. His son was standing near the hostess stand at the far end of the corridor, backpack over one shoulder, completely still. He had come to meet his father after school the way he sometimes did on Tuesday evenings. He was looking through the same glass, watching the same thing. Marcos had absorbed Arthur Crane's contempt just fine. He had not planned on Tomas seeing it. Arthur Crane had not come to the restaurant to eat. That sounds like an odd thing to say about a man sitting at a dinner table, but it was true. He had come because his afternoon had humiliated him, and Arthur Crane was the kind of man who could not carry humiliation without finding somewhere to set it down. The merger had been 18 months in the making. His counterpart, a careful, well-measured man from a private equity firm in Boston, had walked out of the conference room that afternoon without a handshake, without explanation, without even the basic courtesy of a follow-up email. Arthur had stood at the window of his 41st floor office for a long time afterward, watching the city below him, feeling something he almost never felt and could not stand to feel: small. Then his assistant had called. The meeting with the foreign investors, rescheduled twice already, finally locked in for Thursday, had been accidentally confirmed for the wrong location. It would need to be moved again. The investor's office had not been pleased. 2 failures in one afternoon. For most people, that was just a Tuesday. For Arthur Crane, it was an injury that needed tending. Then he arrived at the restaurant with 3 of his associates, men who knew him well enough to read his mood and say very little. They sat, they ordered, and for a while it seemed like the evening might simply be an evening. Then Marcos brought the wine. The sommelier had caught it during the pre-service check. The vintage Arthur's assistant had reserved presented a faint but unmistakable corked smell. Standard practice was to substitute the nearest comparable bottle and inform the table. Marcos had done exactly that. He set the replacement down, explained in plain, courteous terms what had happened, and waited. Arthur looked at the bottle. Then he looked at Marcos. "I didn't ask for a replacement," he said. "I asked for what I ordered." "Of course," Marcos said. The sommelier flagged the original bottle as, "I didn't ask for an explanation either." The table went quiet. One of Arthur's associates studied the breadbasket with great interest. Marcos held the tray and said nothing. There was a pause, the kind that gives a reasonable person time to let something go. And then Arthur picked up his glass, took a slow sip of the wine he claimed not to want, and set it down with the particular sound of a man who had decided the evening was going to go a different way now. It grew from there the way a small fire grows when someone keeps feeding it. The complaint changed shape with each retelling. By the time Arthur turned to his associates to describe the exchange, it had become a story about negligence, about disrespect, about what happened when you let standards slip. His voice rose just enough to carry. Other tables began to notice. That was the point. He called for the manager. Renata came out of the back with the practiced composure of someone who had handled difficult guests before and knew that composure was the only tool that worked. She was 43, had managed this floor for 6 years, and had built the kind of staff that moved like a single careful organism on a busy night. She was good at her job. She was also afraid. Arthur did not give her the chance to speak first. He told her what had happened, his version, in 2 sentences. Then he told her what the Crane Capital corporate account was worth to this restaurant in a year. He did not phrase it as a threat. He did not need to. He looked at Marcos and said calmly that he expected the matter to be addressed appropriately. Renata nodded once. Her face did not change. She looked at Marcos briefly, an nice, a professional look, the kind that carries a message without putting it into words. And then she asked Arthur if she could bring him a complimentary appetizer while she attended to the situation. Arthur sat back and reached for his wine again. Around the room, cutlery had mostly resumed, but not entirely. A couple near the window were speaking quietly without looking at each other. A man at the bar had turned slightly on his stool. Nobody said anything. Nobody was going to. The room had made its quiet, collective decision to let this be someone else's problem, and that decision, Marcos thought standing in the hallway a moment later, was in some ways the saddest thing that had happened all evening. Renata pulled him aside near the kitchen door. She closed it behind them and stood with her arms crossed over her chest, not in anger, but in the way someone stands when they're holding themselves together. She looked at him for a moment. Her voice, when it came, was low and careful, and he could hear the cost of what she was about to say in every word. Marco, I need you to go back out there and apologize. She paused. I need you to do it in front of the room. Marcos looked at her. He looked at the woman who managed this floor, who had no idea, not the faintest idea of who she was actually talking to, who was about to ask him, sincerely and with genuine desperation, to bow in front of a man who had manufactured every moment of this evening from a place of wounded pride. He didn't say anything. He looked through the small window in the kitchen door, past the dining room, to the corridor beyond. Tomas was still there, still standing, still watching. He had 2 choices, and only one of them his son would remember for the rest of his life. Renata was still looking at him, waiting, her arms still folded across her chest. Marcos said, "Give me a moment." She nodded once, grateful even for that, and stepped back toward the kitchen. He heard the door close behind her. He was alone in the hallway now, with the low hum of the ventilation and the muffled sound of the dining room on the other side of the wall, and the particular kind of quiet that only exists in the spaces between hard decisions. He did not move right away. He thought about what Renata had just asked him to do. He turned it over the way you turn over a stone you already know is cold. He could do it. He had absorbed worse. And he had stood in hospital corridors and received news that rearranged the entire architecture of his life. And he had thanked the doctors, and he had walked to the parking garage, and he had sat in his car for 40 minutes before he trusted himself to drive. He knew how to absorb things. He had become, in the past 2 years, very good at it. But then he thought about Elena, not the version of her he tried hardest not to think about. The hospital bed, the morphine, the way her hand felt different near the end, lighter somehow, like something was already leaving. Not that version, the earlier one. Elena at 34, standing in the kitchen of their first apartment in a restaurant apron she'd worn home because she'd forgotten to change, laughing at something he'd said. And her hair still smelling faintly of whatever they'd been cooking that night at the restaurant. She had told him something once, early in their marriage, during a disagreement he no longer fully remembered. She had said it without raising her voice, the way she said most things that mattered. She said the only thing she could never forgive, in him, in herself, in anyone she loved, was making yourself invisible for someone who hadn't earned the right to look away from you. He had nodded at the time. He had agreed. He had filed it somewhere in the part of himself that believed such things in principle without yet understanding what they cost in practice. He understood now. He thought about the 18 months since she died, the shifts, the quiet routines, the way he had folded himself into the rhythm of this restaurant like a man pressing himself flat against a wall, and how he had told himself it was grief, it was honoring her, it was what he needed, and how most of that was true, and some of it was not. Some of it was simply hiding. Some of it was finding the smallest possible version of himself and staying inside it because the smaller you were, the less there was to lose. He thought about Tomas. About the question his son had stopped asking, not because he had found the answer somewhere else, but because, at 15, he had already learned the particular sadness of a question nobody answers often enough. You stop asking it. You stop expecting. You learn to want less because wanting less hurts less, and that is not a thing a boy should have to learn from his father. On Marcos looked through the small window in the kitchen door. Tomas was still there. He hadn't moved. He stood in the corridor near the hostess stand with his backpack strap in one hand, watching through the glass partition at the dining room where Arthur Crane was now leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, performing patience for his associates the way a man performs everything when the only thing he truly cares about is how he appears. Tomas was not frightened. Marcos could see that clearly even from here. He was not crying, not fidgeting, not looking for a way to be somewhere else. He was waiting. There was a difference, and Marcos felt the difference the way you feel a change in temperature, entirely all at once. His son's face held a question that had nothing to do with the restaurant or the wine or Arthur Crane. Plus, it was a question that had been building for 18 months in kitchen silences and short answers and a father who came home and was physically present and somehow wasn't there. It was the question Tomas had been too careful, too kind, too much his mother's son to ask out loud. Who are you going to be right now? Marcos stood with that for a moment, let it settle. Then he set down his tray. He did it slowly, the way you set down something you've been carrying for longer than you realized, with the specific relief of a man who has finally decided he is done carrying it the same way. He set it on the counter beside the door. He straightened his jacket. He ran one hand briefly over the front of his apron, not smoothing it, just feeling it, the fabric, the weight of it. And then he reached into his pocket and took out his phone. He opened an app, navigated through 2 menus to a corporate management portal he had not opened in several weeks, found the account file for Crane Capital Group listed under the Vidal Reinhold subsidiary. He read it quietly, standing in the hallway for exactly 30 seconds. His expression did not change. He put the phone back in his apron pocket. He pushed open the door and walked into the dining room. He did not look like a man about to apologize. The dining room knew something had shifted the moment Marcos walked back through the door. It wasn't anything he did. He didn't raise his voice or change his expression or make any gesture that announced itself. He simply walked, steadily, without hurry, back across the floor toward Arthur Crane's table. But there was something different in the way he moved. The careful smallness was gone. And a room full of people who had been watching all evening felt the difference without being able to name it. Arthur saw him coming and settled further back in his chair, a man receiving what he'd asked for. His arms crossed loosely over his chest, the faint satisfaction of someone who had already written the ending and was simply waiting for the other person to read their lines. Renata stood near the wall by the service station. Her hands were clasped in front of her. She was watching Marcos with the particular stillness of someone bracing for impact. Near the corridor window just visible through the glass, Tomas had moved closer, both palms flat against the wall beside him, as if he needed something solid. Marcos stopped at Arthur's table. He did not look at his shoes. He did not look at Renata. He looked directly at Arthur Crane's and held it the way you hold something that deserves to be held, and said quietly and without any performance at all, "Before I say anything further, there is something you should know about who you are speaking to." Arthur's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not alarm, not yet. More like the slight adjustment of a man who had expected one thing and was now receiving something with a different weight. Marcos took his phone from his apron pocket. He turned the screen to face Arthur and set it on the table between them. On the screen was a corporate account summary. Clean columns of text and figures, the kind of document that requires no interpretation. He spoke in the same tone a person uses to correct a mathematical error. No anger in it, no theater. And he told Arthur that the screen showed a 34% ownership stake in the Vidal Reinhold Group, the parent entity of this restaurant and 4 others across the city. He said the stake had been active for 18 months. He said that the Crane Capital corporate dining account, $400,000 annually, was administered through a subsidiary he personally oversaw. He said that when he had reviewed the account file in the hallway 20 minutes ago, he had found 3 billing discrepancies going back several quarters that his team would be following up on this week. He said all of this in the time it takes to drink a glass of water. Arthur's associate, the one who had been filming, lowered his phone somewhere around the word subsidiary. By the time Marcos finished, the phone was in the man's jacket pocket and his eyes were on the tablecloth. The room was very still, not the uncomfortable stillness of before when people were watching something they didn't want to witness and couldn't look away from. This was a different kind of stillness, the kind that follows the moment a thing that has been wrong for a long time is suddenly irrevocably corrected. Marcos looked at Arthur for a moment, not with triumph. There was no triumph in his face, and that was perhaps the most devastating thing about it, not with contempt. What was in his expression was something quieter and harder to sit with. It looked like pity. "You could have just had dinner," Marcos said. He said it gently, the way you say something to a person you genuinely wish had made a different choice. Then he waited. Arthur Crane sat very still for 3 full seconds. The whole room sat with him, without meaning to. In those 3 seconds, something moved behind his eyes. A rapid, private recalculation. The kind that happens when a man who has built his entire life on knowing exactly where he stands suddenly cannot find the floor. He stood up. The room held its breath to see what that meant, what a man like Arthur Crane does in the moment the ground disappears beneath him. Whether he argues, whether he blusters, whether he finds from somewhere one more way to perform. He did none of those things. He straightened his jacket. The gesture was almost identical to the one Marcos had made in the hallway. Deliberate, quiet, a man composing himself before walking into something difficult. If Arthur noticed the echo, he gave no sign. He turned from the table without a word and walked toward the door. His 3 associates rose and followed, the movement carrying the muted, practiced quality of men who had learned long ago to match his exits. Near the door, one of them glanced back, just once, briefly, over his shoulder. His eyes found Marcos. His expression was not readable, not quite guilt, not quite respect, somewhere in the narrow space between them. Then he turned and walked out. The front door closed. The rain was still coming down hard outside. For 3 seconds, the dining room held the silence like something fragile. And then, from a table near the window, a single person began to clap. It was a woman, somewhere in her 60s, sitting alone with a half-finished glass of red wine. She clapped steadily, without embarrassment, looking directly at Marcos. A moment later, the couple beside her joined. Then the man at the bar. Then, one by one, the rest of the room. Not a roar, not a standing ovation, but something warmer and more considered than either. The sound of people who had been quiet too long and were glad, finally, to have something worth responding to. Marcos did not take a bow. He did not smile for the room or raise a hand in acknowledgement. He turned unhurried and looked through the glass partition to the corridor. Tomas was standing with both palms still pressed flat against the wall. His backpack had slipped off one shoulder. His face, his son's face, Elena's jaw, and Marcos's eyes was doing something it had not done in a long time. It was open, wide open, like a window in a room that had been closed for too long. The audit took 4 days. Marcos did it himself, but quietly at the kitchen table after Tomas had gone to bed, going through 3 years of Crane Capital billing records the way you go through something you already suspect and are simply confirming. The double charges were not subtle once you knew to look for them. Venue fees billed twice under slightly different line items, the kind of discrepancy that disappears inside a large corporate account unless someone with the right access bothers to check. Arthur's team had been running it for 18 months. The total came to just under $40,000. Marcos forwarded the file to the group's legal team on a Thursday morning with a single line of instruction. Handle it. No press, no announcement, no call to Arthur Crane to give him the opportunity to explain himself. The account was terminated the same afternoon. Arthur did not call. Yet he did not email. He did not send anyone on his behalf. For a man who had walked into that restaurant like he owned it, he disappeared with remarkable efficiency. The world moved on, the way it always does, as if the dining room had simply had an ordinary Tuesday. It was Renata who was hardest to face in the end. Marcos sat across from her in the small manager's office off the back hallway. The same hallway where she had asked him to apologize, though neither of them mentioned that, and told her the truth. All of it. The stake in the group, the reason he had taken the uniform. Elena. He watched her face move through disbelief, then a long, careful silence, then something that was not quite hurt but lived in the same neighborhood. She looked at her hands on the desk for a moment, then she looked up. Why didn't you ever say anything? He thought about it seriously. He always gave that question the weight it deserved. Because Elena would have wanted me to understand it first, he said. Renata was quiet for another moment, then she nodded. A single, slow nod, the kind that means I don't fully understand this yet, but I believe you. And that was the end of the conversation about it. She was promoted to regional manager before the month was out. She accepted without making a speech about it, which was one of the many reasons she deserved it. The staff were the harder adjustment. Word moved through a restaurant floor the way it moves through any small enclosed world, quickly, thoroughly, and with embellishments. Within a week, everyone who worked the floor knew something of what had happened. And the ones who knew began treating Marcos with a careful formality that he found in its own way more uncomfortable than the cruelty of the night that had caused it. They held doors. They deferred. They stopped asking him to cover shifts the way they used to, as if he had become something that needed to be handled rather than simply worked alongside. He spent several weeks quietly dismantling it. He covered shifts. He refilled water glasses without being asked. He cleaned tables at the end of service, and he did it without ceremony, and eventually, gradually, the floor found its way back to something close to what it had been. Not identical. You can't entirely unknow a thing, but close enough that the work felt like work again, which was what he had come for. Also, on a Sunday morning in late November, he brought Tomas in for the brunch prep shift. He didn't make a reason for it or frame it as anything significant. He simply said the night before that he was going in early and Tomas could come if he wanted to. Tomas shrugged in the way teenagers shrug at things they want but will not admit to wanting, and the next morning he was up before Marcos. He didn't say much in the kitchen. He followed instructions, carried things when asked, watched the way the prep team moved around each other in the tight space with the practiced ease of people who had learned each other's rhythms. At one point, Marcos looked over and saw his son standing very still near the pass-through window, watching the dining room being set for service. The tablecloths smoothed flat, the glasses turned right side up. So the small adjustments that turned an empty room into a place where people would soon sit and eat and feel for an hour looked after. Tomas didn't say anything, but he watched for a long time. Months passed. The restaurant floor turned over to winter menus and then slowly back towards spring. Marcos kept his 2 shifts a week. He stopped counting them as grief and started counting them as something without a name that he didn't need to name. The moment he knew something had changed in Tomas came on a Tuesday evening, unremarkable in every visible way. Tomas was at the kitchen table with his homework spread out, and Marcos was at the counter doing nothing in particular. And without looking up, without any preamble at all, Tomas said, "I think what you do is pretty good, Dad." Marcos did not respond right away. And he set down what was in his hands. He looked at his son at the top of his bent head, the pencil moving across the page, the casual certainty of someone who had said a thing because it was simply true and needed saying. He didn't trust his voice for a moment, so he said nothing. He just stood there in the kitchen that still smelled faintly of Elena's cooking even after all this time and let the words settle into him like something long overdue. Later that night, and after Tomas had gone to bed, after the apartment had gone quiet, Marcos drove to the restaurant. It was closed. The chairs were up on the tables, the lights were down to the low, warm glow they left on overnight, and the room looked the way rooms look when no one is watching them, honest, still, themselves. He went behind the bar and poured a glass of the wine Elena had always loved, a small one. He carried it to a stool near the end of the counter, and he sat down and he held the glass without drinking it for a while, looking out at the empty dining room. He did not think about Arthur Crane. He had not thought about Arthur Crane in some time, and the absence of that thought felt clean, like a window left open. He thought about Elena, the way she used to move through a busy dining room, not rushing, never rushing, as if she had all the time in the world for every single person in it. The way she could make a stranger feel in the space of a single exchange that they had been expected. that they were welcome exactly as they were, that someone had been waiting for them specifically and was glad they had come. That was the thing no credential had ever given anyone, the thing no title protected. The thing Arthur Crane had walked into that restaurant with every resource in the world to buy and had not thought to ask for. Marcos lifted the glass. He took a slow sip. He set it back down. What Arthur Crane had seen that night was a waiter who would not fight back. What he had missed, what the whole room had missed, was a man who had already won something that had nothing to do with ownership stakes or billing audits or whose name appeared on the account file. He had won it in a back hallway, standing alone with a tray he was about to set down. He had decided, quietly and without announcing it to anyone, to stop disappearing. That was the only victory that had ever mattered. Everything else was just paperwork. The restaurant was very still. On outside, the city moved the way cities move at that hour, continuous, indifferent, full of people carrying lives that no one around them could see. The next time you are in a restaurant, look at the person refilling your water. Look at the person carrying the tray, clearing the table, moving through the room with a quiet competence the room takes entirely for granted. You do not know their story. You do not know what they studied, what they built, what they lost, what they are choosing right now, tonight, to keep showing up for. Neither did Arthur Crane. That turned out to be his most expensive mistake.